What is better, psychology or neuroscience? Hello and welcome to Understanding Emotions. My name is Sankalp. I'm a PhD student in psychology at the University of Oxford and in neuroscience. I study both. Hey, look, it's a common question and I don't know why it is so common, to be honest. And the simple answer to this question is both. Like, why does it have to be psychology or neuroscience? But I'm going to give a much more detailed answer so that we understand what these fields are, what they do, and what's the ultimate objective? Why are we studying these things and what are the problems they are solving? Okay, so let's start with psychology. Psychology, simply put, is the study of the mind. Neuroscience, on the other hand, by the way, is the study of the brain. And yes, these two things are separate things. Now, the question that this begs is, how are these two things related? And no one knows. It's often called the hard problem of consciousness, which is, how does this material body, the material brain, something that you can hold and touch, which I've had the privilege of holding a brain, it's a surreal feeling to have. How does all of that lead to consciousness, which is feelings and thoughts and emotions and joy and laughter and anger and all of that thing? And no one knows the answer to that. I refer you to the philosophers of mind. David Chalmers is one of them, and so on. But anyway, psychology is the study of the mind. Neuroscience, on the other hand, is the study of the brain. Now, when you say which is better or which is more important, the question is, what do you mean by better? What do you mean by important? What is the problem you are trying to solve? Now, for most people, the core problem when they look to psychology or neuroscience is the problem of suffering. It is usually something like, I'm feeling in a way that I should not be feeling in, or don't want to feel. So for example, if I have some negative emotion, I have a lot of anger and I'm not able to manage my anger. Oh, should I look at psychologists? Should I look at neuroscientists? Let's say if I'm feeling a bit sad or depressed, for that matter. And of course, if there's any clinical thing, I suggest you take clinical advice. But let's say you're sad or depressed or not feeling well enough. That's where normally people search these things. That's where they want to get neuroscience and psychology. And the other set of questions I get is from students who want to decide their majors and want to see what they want to do. Should they do psychology or should they do neuroscience? And psychiatry is often a third thing that comes here if you're going the medical route. So let's talk about these things. It's going to be a casual conversations, but hopefully it will answer some questions. So to solve the core problem of suffering, to solve the core problem of unhappiness, I think psychology is better. And the reason for that is it directly handles suffering. Now, in my thesis, in my PhD thesis, I've studied both. And I've studied social connection, its impact on mental health, and its neural correlates, which is what does it do in the brain. So I have a good understanding of these different areas, to some extent at least. And the reason why I think psychology is better at solving the problem of suffering is because it's a much more direct, it hits suffering much more directly. And by that I mean, if you had suffering, I would not suggest you go to a neuroscientist. They're not probably going to be helpful to you. But if you go to a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, they're probably going to be helpful to you. And the reason for that is suffering happens in the mind. It's at the core, it's a problem with the mind, quote unquote problem. And I say quote unquote because suffering is indeed natural and everyone who's ever born suffers. So we may want to reconsider if problem is the right framing around it. But anyway, so going to a psychologist is going to resolve that problem, even if you're looking for high levels of mental health. So I'm not just talking about, okay, how do I get from this negative state into functioning, which is what a lot of therapists do. But it's also about, look, I'm okay right now. How do I go above that? How do I go to thriving states of mind? How do I feel in a way that I feel belong to this world? I have friends. I can go and talk to anyone. I can public speak and improvise extemporaneously. All of these are just symptoms of like thriving states of mind, right? How can I enjoy the bright, beautiful sunlight and travel and all of these things? Yeah, psychology is better. Studying psychology will help, especially if you study clinical psychology. It will help a lot with relationships. There's a lot of good literature on attachment theory. There's a lot of good therapists out there who practice something like CBT or IFS. There are good podcasts like these. That's why most of this podcast talks about psychology. I don't talk a lot about the brain. And the reason for that is precisely because it's much more practical, much more direct, much more value added, and you can put it into practice. And even probably hearing me speak about it is somewhat curative, it's somewhat healing. And so therefore psychology is better for the problem of suffering. Now, suffering is not just the only problem in this world to solve. I do think it's the most important problem. But first of all, even if suffering is your only concern, how do you study it? Like if I were to solve that problem, then I must study that problem, right? And I'm not talking about individually you. I'm talking about collectively. How do we understand this thing at its core? And how do you do this sort of psychological quote-unquote research? Now, sure, you could, it's very hard to get into someone's mind and there's no direct access there. And you cannot image the mind. You cannot do an X-ray of the mind and find out exactly what's going on. But you can do that with the brain. So even if you want to solve the problem of unhappiness, you can start looking at the brain because it's much more tangible. I know how to do a brain scan. I know what neurotransmitters are in your brain. And maybe, just maybe, that kind of study will also help with suffering. Now, it is a bit of a leap, and I don't particularly know of a lot of research that has helped with psychological problems. Like I don't necessarily know of studies done in the neuroscience world that have had a direct, clear impact on clinical practice. You could argue that discoveries about dopamine and serotonin have, but at the same time, we don't necessarily know what these neurotransmitters are doing entirely. So I think neuroscience is a much more long-term approach for understanding suffering and happiness. And it's a much more, it's a required approach. So we know that what happens in the mind has something to do with the brain. We don't know how connected they are. And for the purposes of this conversation, let's not even assume that the brain leads the mind or the mind leads to the brain. And that is a whole discussion of its own, as I said. But irrespective of being agnostic about that relationship, it is still, if you want to understand the mind, you have to understand the brain because we know there is a relationship there. How? Because if you lesion, like if some parts of the brain get taken off due to an accident or injury and so on, we know it affects your mind. It affects your memory. We know, of course, ultimately, if the damage is significant enough, it's all lights out, even death for that matter. So we know there is a relationship. We just don't know what it is. And of course, we know it from the other side as well. We know if you meditate, for example, there will be changes to your brain. If you engage in social connection, if you talk to people, there will be changes to your brain. So of course, the relationship can be that way. Or of course, the relationship goes the other way around as well. So that is number one, suffering and unhappiness. The other set of problems also are things like diseases involving the brain. For example, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Things like dopamine deficiency caused by Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Potentially dopamine deficiencies caused by illnesses like schizophrenia or movement dopamine-based disorders. And to study all of that, to study brain health, we have to look at the brain. Now, of course, that is going to have an impact on mental health because we know that the mind and brain are connected. So I view the study of the brain as important theoretical foundations for the study of the mind. We cannot have just the study of the mind. For me, to solve the problem of suffering is the most important problem. Even if we can make a little bit progress about making people happier, that's a great problem and a very important problem to solve. But I think to do that purely on the mind it's very intangible. You can't hold the mind, you can see the mind, you don't know what's happening. Now, of course, there are methodologies like meditation, which I practice and many people practice, which is one way to inquire what's happening in the mind. It is completely legitimate, I think, but it has its limitations as a study of the mind because you can only ever observe your own mind. Like, how do you make generalizations about minds? It's very hard to do. You can observe behavior, and most psychologists who purely study psychology, they observe behavior. So do I as a PhD student. But then looking at the brain can give you so much more insights about what's happening under the hood and what sorts of systems are involved. And with more and more knowledge, we may be able to understand these emotional system much, much better. And to that point, we may have a more closer corresponding between what's happening in your brain and what's happening in your mind. And hopefully, the path to healing can involve the study of neuroscience as well. As of now, there's very little neuroscience we can use in the process of healing itself. But the more we understand about neurotransmitters, I think dopamine is probably the most translatable, so to speak, because we know how dopamine functions, the different time scales in which it functions. And I have a whole video on dopamine, the phasic and tonic cycles. And we could do things like, not stacking too many dopamine related activities, because we might lose like an inherent pleasure about the certain activity, so on and so forth. So these are some translational applications. But coming back to the original question, which is more important? Neither. Assuming the focus is on suffering and emotions, we have to study both. So in that case, both are important. But here's the thing. Why does it have to stop with psychology and neuroscience? I just before recording this episode, I recorded an episode about health. And I talked about supplements. I still have those around me. Now, these things are not affecting the brain directly, as in these are not necessarily stimulants. These are not psychoactive substances. But still, they help with your mood. They still help you feel better. And so why even make that distinction between the brain and the body in that case? Why stop at the brain rather? Now, I'm not saying the body and the brain have equal impact on the mind. I think the brain definitely has more. But the body is relevant as well. And ultimately, what we're getting at is what's called unity of knowledge. Like a lot of these disciplines, like psychology, neuroscience, psychiatry, so on and so forth, these are distinctions made primarily for logistical reasons by universities, so that we know what classes to fill students in, so that we know what to focus on, so that we can create some sense of this knowledge. But that doesn't mean reality itself is compartmentalized as psychology or neuroscience. The reality is both. Or an understanding in reality requires a knowledge of both and more. It requires a knowledge of understanding things like your exercise physiology, like your VO2 max, and things like that, because that's going to help you live longer. And we know that something like strength training helps with feeling better because it leads to the release of endorphins in the brain. Now, is strength training psychology or neuroscience? Neither. It's more. So remember, knowledge itself is not compartmentalized into university bins. These are more logistical things, so that we can award people majors, we can make sense of what their study is like. But that does not necessarily mean that to solve the problems with the mind, or to solve the problem of suffering, to make people happier, that one domain has complete authority on it. And I believe that we should study as much as we can, including social connection, social skills, exercise, nutrition, sleep. All of that is important if we care about understanding our emotions truly and fully. Hope that helps answering that question, whether you are a student looking for some advice on which majors to pick, or whether you are just curious about this world and about our emotions.